Okay, so my glasses on here. My paper is called The Political Implications of William H. Poteet's Philosophy. And actually what it is, it's really essentially kind of like an outline for a book project. And so it's probably a little sketchy, like it's basically a series of sort of chapter drafts that are kind of radically condensed and kind of stitched together. So it's a little bit sort of sketchy maybe, but sort of, it's basically kind of a synthesis of what's been going on in a lot of political theory and theology, actually, since World War II. So it's pretty broad in scope. Actually, as it happens, both presenters this morning kind of stole some of my thunder because they kind of touched on some things, especially like the ambiguity of modernity, especially. But let me read it to you here. Okay, now, okay, just an introduction here. Since the Second World War, political theory has increasingly focused on one question, namely the genesis and nature of the modern age. Now, the modern era, usually regarded as beginning about the year 1500, has been characterized by scientific and technological advances that have dramatically improved human material well-being, and by political reform and revolutionary movements that have attempted to establish greater individual freedom, so that modernity understands itself as a story of human progress. But modern progress has been ambiguous in a number of ways. First, many of the same political theories that demanded greater freedom for Western people simultaneously rationalized European subjugation of other cultures. Modernity is also the story of Western racism and imperialism. Second, at least some of the modern revolutionary movements dedicated to creating freedom instead developed into tyrannies much worse than anything seen in the pre-modern world. Of course, obviously a reference to communism. The modern age has produced both freedom and totalitarianism. Third, ever since the early 19th century, significant questions have been raised about whether the political and technological changes of the modern age really have increased human freedom. Fears that humans have become slaves to their machines, and that modern impersonal bureaucracies have become a kind of administrative despotism, are now so commonplace to become staples of popular culture. Fourth, over the past few decades, serious doubts have arisen about whether modern technological development isn't really environmentally sustainable. The material progress of the modern era may turn out to be very short-lived. And finally, and most radically, the philosophical presuppositions of modernity, taken to a logical conclusion, appear to result in a thoroughgoing nihilism, recognized as early as the late 19th century by Friedrich Nietzsche, emerging in spectacular practical terms in the insane slaughter of the 20th century's world wars, and now manifested more subtly in the impending demographic suicide of post-war consumer culture. Basically, post-war Western consumers don't have any children, essentially. Okay? Now, as a consequence, since World War II, there has developed a substantial consensus among political theorists that the modern worldview definitively established by the Enlightenment is at least partly incoherent, and thus has become morally, socially, and ecologically destructive. These theorists argue that alternative models of the relationships among humans and between humans and their environment must be developed. But developing alternatives to modernity requires understanding what precisely modernity is all about. Hence the focus on the origins and essence of the modern age. Okay? So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to spend a bit of time talking about some people other than Poteat, and then try to make a synthesis, and of course, as actually kind of like the title of the last section, Poteat is sort of the linchpin for that whole synthesis. Okay? Now, the most important attempt to understand the essence of the modern era, immediately after the First World War made it clear Christ existed, was, of course, that of Martin Heidegger. And Heidegger argues that early modern philosophy made a fatal mistake in attempting to ground knowledge in the human subject, that is, in attempting to describe the structures of the mind that allow humans to receive a clear, objective picture of external reality, as this project leads inevitably to the conclusion that external reality is actually a creation of the mind. Modernity ends in a rampant subjectivism that reduces the world and even human beings to objects for technological exploitation, and in a final bizarre twist, regards even scientific knowledge as nothing but human interpretation. Now, Heidegger eventually traces the subjectivist tendencies of modernity back to Plato's attempt to reduce the multiplicity of reality to a finite, static cosmic structure, and ultimately recommends a rearticulation of the pre-philosophical pagan cosmos and a consequent displacement of humans from center stage in the universe as an alternative to the Western rationalist tradition. And of course, his most direct influence is found in postmodernism. But again, ultimately, his work has sort of provided, at least implicitly, the starting point for most subsequent attempts to understand the essence of the modern age. Now, during and shortly after the Second World War, several attempts were made to refine Heidegger's initial analysis. Perhaps the best known of these is the argument of the Frankfurt School, as developed by Horkheimer and Adorno, and later modified by Jürgen Habermas, that the essence of modernity is not so much subjectivism per se, as the manner in which the modern age has conceptualized the subject, that is, in terms of instrumental rationality. That's a really key point. That's something I think Poteat would agree with, that again, the problem isn't exactly the subject, but the way it was conceptualized. Now, Horkheimer and Adorno argue, in effect, that the rational subject could be a valid foundation for knowledge and political order if understood in a broader manner than that in the Enlightenment, which thought of the subject primarily, if not exclusively, in terms of its capacity for technical control of nature. Now, Habermas has developed this analysis further by arguing that the modern age is characterized by a tension between what he calls communicative rationality and subject-centered reason. Okay, communicative rationality that has the capacity for intersubjective communication that has allowed science, parliamentary democracy, and other positive features of modernity to develop and flourish. And then again, the instrumental rationalism identified by Horkheimer and Adorno, which refers to subject-centered reason, is the Enlightenment's misinterpretation of the scientific revolution as embodied in Cartesian and Kantian rationalism, and which practically is manifested in various forms of reductionism. Now, again, the critical thing here, again, is that what you've got, okay, this is what we talked about this morning. Habermas is probably one of the first political theorists to really kind of think of modernity as kind of an ambiguous thing. It gets it partly right, but only partly. And of course, his idea was to sort of like articulate what he called communicative rationality. I'm not sure we really got that far along in that process, but that was sort of the basic idea. And again, that's something not entirely, unlike what Poteat's talking about. Okay, now, several later theories broaden the scope of inquiry beyond that of Heidegger and the Frankfurt School, but regarding modern subjectivism as essentially derivative from more general ontological conceptions. Of course, Heidegger's student Leo Strauss, at least in one possible interpretation, or a number of possible interpretations, sees subjectivism as a logical consequence of the mechanistic ontology first articulated by Thomas Hobbes and René Descartes in the 17th century. And sort of just looking at it politically, for Strauss, the human desires which form the basis for modern conceptions of natural rights, which of course are understood by Hobbes as products of mechanical causation, are exposed by Jean-Jacques Rousseau, really just simply working out the logical implication of Hobbes' own ontology as really just human social constructions. That's sort of where natural right theory kind of goes down the drain, okay? And that's sort of, in a sense, again, kind of sort of a political application of sort of Heidegger's broader point. Now, another sort of take on things, although Strauss sees modernity as making an explicit break with pre-modern ontology, most subsequent political theorists have urged that modernity's origins tend to lie in the medieval era, that is to say, in Christianity. And among other people, Eric Voegelin has posited that the political movements of the modern age could best be understood as immanentized versions of Christian eschatological expectations. How many have read Voegelin in this group here? Oh, not that many. Okay, let me explain it then. Okay. Well, I was going to discuss in a little bit more detail anyway, because again, his formulations are pretty important when we sort of turn to like Poteat. Okay. Now, Voegelin's characterization of modernity is that it's a partial revival of the ancient phenomena of Gnosticism. Now, I'm sure you know what Gnosticism is, right? Yeah, okay. Now, so basically for Voegelin, the modern, supposedly secular ideologies are essentially kind of like updated versions of Gnosticism. That is, they are attempts to escape human finitude and achieve a realm of perfection through esoteric knowledge. Now, of course, whereas the relevant knowledge in the ancient world is mystical in nature, the modern versions hope for progress towards perfection through immanent knowledge, as in scientism, revolutionary Marxism, etc. Okay? Now, I go into a bit of detail on sort of like where Voegelin sort of traces that back in Christianity. And he ultimately sort of, okay, it's kind of interesting, he ultimately ends up sort of saying that Christianity sort of made a mistake in sort of thinking of Revelation as being closed with Christ. And that leads him to kind of process theology. I think he's kind of way off base there, but that does sort of tie some themes later on. Anyway, I also wanted to note here, Voegelin is probably somewhat sloppy in his use of the term Gnosticism. Of course, the ancient Gnostics regarded matter as evil and wanted to escape from it, but the modern movements Voegelin labels as Gnostic are generally thoroughly materialistic and indeed usually regard ideas about the spiritual realm as delusory. So it seems kind of peculiar to describe as Gnostic individuals and movements dedicated to political action in the material world. The better term to describe the political movements Voegelin is concerned with would likely be millenarian. And you've all heard that term, I'm sure. Okay. Stated most simply, millenarian movements regard the world, at least the social world, as to be in a state of corruption, but anticipate a divine intervention that will perfect the world, or at least correct the corrupted social order. Now again, here the parallel with various modern political movements, of course, quite obvious. And Voegelin does himself sometimes sort of use the term millenarianism sort of interchangeably with Gnosticism. So in a sense, okay, obviously now again, the difference, of course, in modern millenarianism, of course, it's going to be people, not God, who perfect the world, but kind of a similar kind of idea, okay? Now, as it happens, okay, the term Gnosticism is probably still helpful because I think you can make a distinction, make a distinction between the political movements of rising expectations, like the Puritan, French, and Russian revolutions, in which, as we just noted, could be described as, in a sense, kind of millenarian. Those on the one hand, and then later movements or sort of psychic orientations based on disillusionment, such as fascism, or those being called expressive individualism. How many have heard the term expressive individualism? Yeah, oh, not that many, okay. Okay, expressive individualism, well, it's basically our culture today, essentially. A culture of aesthetic, artistic self-expression, okay? A kind of a sort of a crude, democratized version of Nietzsche, with still a few remnants of Christianity, express yourself by killing other people, basically, okay? But essentially, yeah, the point of life is to be an artist, okay? So everyone should be an artist, and we spend our life either creating or consuming works of art, okay? Now, that, again, I think you could call that a kind of sort of, along with, like, say, fascism, a kind of Gnostic movement, because it's really kind of based on a kind of disillusionment, and it is sort of like an attempt against sort of like escape the world. Okay? Yeah, okay, one might say that disappointment of millenarian expectations tends to lead to Gnostic alienation from the world, and in fact, I'll use this formulation later in the essay. More on this in a second. Okay? Now, finally, another position, taken recently by Charles Taylor, Michael Gillespie, and others, finds the origin of modernity in late medieval nominalism. Of course, now you know what nominalism is, right?
What is it?
Nominalism?
Normalism.
No, nominalism.
Nominalism.
Yeah, right, yeah. Okay. Now, essentially, these theorists argue that during the Reformation and in the earliest more or less secular political theories, the nominalist conception of God as pure, unrestricted, irresistible will was transferred into humans, who are, of course, made in God's image, resulting in the subjectivism and perfectionism of modernity. Gillespie also points out the Enlightenment tended to transfer the nominalist God's irresistible will into nature, thus resulting, as we'll see in a second, in the mechanistic ontology also of modernity. Okay? So that's kind of a quick rundown on about like 4 or 5 kind of different theories of what the modern world is all about that kind of emerged after, or sort of during and after the World War period. Okay? Now, even such a cursory examination of the development of political theory in the post-war era shows clearly that the major theories increasingly point towards theological issues. And as it happens, recent theologians, like political theorists, have focused considerable energy on the issues of modernity's origins. Now, these theological analyses indicate that the political theories discussed above are correct in seeing modernity as derivative from Christianity, but tend to have kind of a sort of a simplistic conception or understanding of the theological issues involved. Although, on the other hand, I guess you might say sort of the theological sort of limitations of the political theories do sort of kind of inadvertently point towards probably incoherent aspects of sort of classical Christian theology. Okay? So look at a few of these now. I mentioned briefly, of course, Karl Barth, who's kind of in a sense, kind of actually sort of anticipates Heidegger's arguments like about the subject. Now, more recently, about a generation after Barth, Reinhold Niebuhr developed an interpretation of the modern age sort of similar to that of Vogelin. Niebuhr sees the idea of progress and its denial of human sinfulness as the essence of modernity, and sees modern notions of progress as developing from the overly benign view of human nature that results from the medieval synthesis of Greek and biblical anthropologies. The ancient Greek philosophers had a high estimate of the human capacity for virtue, but low estimate of overall human capacities, seeing humans as having only minimal ability to affect their environment. The biblical authors had a much greater sense of human agency, but of course a very low view of human virtue, seeing human agency as corrupted by sin. The medieval synthesis of these two views eventually resulted in the Renaissance view of humans as having tremendous abilities to change the world and the virtue to do so successfully, leading to modern progressivism, ultimately millenarianism. Okay, so again, kind of a synthesis of certain aspects of Greek and biblical pictures of the world gives you this incredibly optimistic picture of human capacities. That's the key take of Niebuhr. Now, kind of as a bit of a counter to that, okay, the Catholic theologian Henri de Lubac. How many have heard of Lubac? A few have, okay, yeah. He can be read as developing a partial insight achieved by Niebuhr, and thereby, I think, clarifying the nature of modernity in the Catholic world. Now, an obvious criticism of Niebuhr's argument is that it does have a certain conceptual plausibility, but doesn't fit the historical facts, well, as, of course, modern culture developed more completely in the Protestant countries than in the Catholic world. So it seems a bit strange to locate the origins of modernity in Catholicism. Now, the reason Niebuhr's analysis seems conceptually plausible because it is based on a once conventional interpretation of Thomas Aquinas' position on nature, grace, and sin. Okay? Now, Aquinas is usually presented as having argued that God created humans with a pure, essentially Aristotelian nature, and then added a supernatural gift to humans to give humans a higher nature than other beings. Now, as Niebuhr understands Aquinas, only the supernatural gift is lost or corrupted through original sin, so that an uncorrupted, pure nature still remains, which can then be conceived as perfectible, leading to the semi-Pelagianism of Catholic theology and the full-blown Pelagianism of the Renaissance and modernity. Now, Lubbock argues, however, that the idea of a pure nature and supernatural addition is not actually found in Aquinas, but rather emerged through the neo-scholastic misinterpretation of his writings that heavily influenced the Council of Trent. Aquinas, according to Lubbock, thought that God created humans with a radically different nature than other beings, one capable of a supernatural end, with nature and grace not as readily separable as the neo-scholastic interpretation implies, and thus also with no possibility of a pure nature uncorrupted by sin. The anthropological formulations seen by Niebuhr as the precursor of modern progressivism did not really emerge until after the Renaissance and Reformation, and therefore could not really have influenced Protestant culture. As discussed below, however, it could explain modern tendencies in the Catholic world. Okay? Now finally, a more recent position, held by Robert Jensen, Colin Gunton, and several theologians from the Eastern Orthodox tradition, is that the origins of modernity can be found in the failure of Christianity to develop a truly Trinitarian theology. Now again, I'll discuss Gunton in a little bit more detail. How many have heard of Colin Gunton, by the way? Oh, Beth has. One or two others. Okay, yeah. G-U-N-T-O-N, Gunton. Now, in Gunton's view, theology after the Council of Nicaea failed to work out the implications of the doctrine of the Trinity, focusing primarily on the Father, only secondarily on the Son, and hardly at all on the Holy Spirit. Thus, Christianity drifted towards a rather one-dimensional picture of God, conceiving of him primarily as creator, and as creating primarily, if not exclusively, through sheer, perhaps arbitrary will. It tended to conceive of nature in static terms as the product of a sort of one-shot creative act, rather than an ongoing process. And it was very slow to recognize fully the extent of human freedom implied in the Trinitarian formulation. This meant that as a greater sense of human agency developed in the early modern era, it tended to be conceptualized as pure will, the model of God's agency, and it tended to be increasingly seen as in competition with the apparently arbitrary will of God. Thus, modernity is characterized by an increasingly radical assertion of human will, resulting in the reduction of nature and even humans themselves to objects of technical manipulation. Okay, so that's Gunton. Now, he argues then that the dilemmas of modernity can be resolved by working out the critical implication of the Trinitarian model, that God exists in harmonious plurality. The Western philosophical and theological tradition, thanks to Plato, has an overpowering tendency to see plurality as conflictual and order as possible only through unity. This tendency is why post-Nicene theology, beginning with Augustine, tended to reduce the Trinity to the person of the Father. But the harmonious plurality of the Trinity means that the Holy Spirit, in perfecting creation, brings about what Gunton calls the realization of particularity, from which we can finally conclude that the particularity of created beings is established by the particularity of the heart of the being of the Creator. This leads to a relational understanding of the world, where beings are understood in terms of their relationship to God and others. Politically, then, a truly Trinitarian theology would imply that humans attempt to work out and put in practice a truly relational approach to each other in the natural world. This would imply a politics that, while allowing and indeed encouraging human freedom, would understand that freedom is a more subtle matter than is generally understood in present-day liberal societies, and in particular, true freedom is possible only within the context of community. Similarly, it would result in a new understanding of the human relation to nature, one that can mean a new, non-instrumental type of technology that would be environmentally sustainable, but still allow a reasonable level of material prosperity for all. Okay? So that's kind of Gunton's take on things. Now, next section, I make kind of a preliminary synthesis before I bring Poteat in, although really I couldn't make this synthesis without Poteat in the first place. Okay? So this kind of getting a little bit ahead of the game here. Okay, now, at this point I think three conclusions can be at least tentatively drawn. Okay, now first, it is likely that the modern age has its origin in Christianity. Since all the apparent features of modernity taken as essential by various theorists, subjectivism, mechanism, progressivism, can be traced to issues in Christianity. There's a pretty clear line of thought from the Reformation, the Council of Trent, to the materialistic rationalism of the Enlightenment, and from there to the aesthetic or neo-pagan irrationalism of late modernity. Okay? Now, if modern political theories, though, are incoherent and ultimately nihilistic, then classical Christian theology must have also been incoherent in some way. And indeed, this is the conclusion theologians themselves have generally drawn. Okay? Now, second, as already discussed, the modern age is probably best understood as ambiguous in nature. Now, here a fairly clear evolution can be discerned. Most of the earliest attempts by political theorists and theologians to understand the nature of the modern age saw it as uniformly negative, as an inexorable slide from the naive rationalism of the Enlightenment to nihilism and technological world war. But this picture is certainly too simple. Modernity does seem to have some legitimate accomplishments, most notably in the dramatic improvement in the material conditions of life that have brought about, in particular in the spectacular increase in life expectancy over the past 200 years. I guess you probably most seen like 200 years ago, human life expectancy at birth is like about 25 years, because you guys have high rates of infant and child mortality. Up until pretty recently, the odds are you would die as a child, basically. Okay? So, I mean, that's been a dramatic improvement. Okay, now, Warner-Wann's picture of the modern age can be found in the more recent theorists. Habermas is noted above to be the obvious example, but Gillespie, Taylor, Gunton, and others have also indicated that the modern review appears at least partly correct. And this is also the position held by both Popes John Paul II and Benedict XVI, and indeed that really appears to be the position of Michael Polanyi also. The modern age sort of partly gets it right, but only partly. Now, the recognition that modernity is ambiguous has an important implication for the concept of progress, namely that whether or not it is the essential feature of modernity, it is perhaps not as entirely mistaken as some of the earlier post-war theorists assumed. One might make a valid distinction between sort of moderate, tentative social progress and extreme, essentially millenarian expectations of perfection. In fact, I'll return to this below. Okay? Now, third thing, an examination of the various theories of modernity tends to indicate that not only is modernity not all evil, it is also not monolithic. Okay? That is, modern thought and modern civilization has developed differently in different areas of the Western world. Okay? First of all, the tendency towards subjectivism is probably strongest in Germany. Okay? And that's probably why Heidegger saw it as the essence of modernity. Conversely, the mechanistic ontology of modernity is clearly most prominent in the English-speaking world, and probably derives from the powerful influence of Calvinism there. And finally, the trajectory of modernity in the Catholic world seems to be significantly different, and it's probably best captured by Lubbock, as I'll explain below. Okay, now then, I'll now sketch out kind of a rough synthesis, and then sort of to get things started for looking at Poteat. Okay, now accepting that modernity is ambiguous, and assuming that the positive aspects of modernity have their origin in Christianity, again, I have to use Poteat to make that claim, I will focus on the negative dimension of modern thought in the modern age. Now, I think Gunton is correct in arguing that the key issue is Christianity's inability to develop a truly Trinitarian theology. From this comes a tendency, as discussed above, to understand God as pure will, a tendency that reaches logical conclusion in nominalism. And the Reformation's attempts to come to grips with the implications of nominalism appear to lead directly to the mechanistic tendency of modern English-speaking thought and also German subjectivism. Calvin, of course, is the key link for the English-speaking world. For him, the nominalist conception of God means that the universe must be ultimately predetermined by God's will, a conclusion most obviously manifests in his concept of predestination. Thomas Hobbes, in effect, merely replaces God's will with the absolute mathematical determination of mechanical forces, leading to the modern English-speaking picture of reality and its political, economic, and social embodiment, liberal capitalism. Luther is the critical figure in Germany. His attempt to understand how human will submits to God's will leads pretty directly to the obsession with the subject, that could be both individual or collective, found in Kant, Hegel, Marx, and Nietzsche, and therefore to Heidegger's assessment that subjectivism is the essence of modernity. Now, the situation in the Catholic world is a little bit more complicated, but again, I think Gunton can provide the starting point. Okay, essentially, according to Gunton, in addition to conceiving of God as pure will, the Western theological traditions also tend to conceive of nature as essentially static. Okay, that is not necessarily all that different from Aristotle's sort of static natural cosmos. Now, Lubbock's analysis implies that, in effect, Aquinas' conception of human nature and grace was able to move at least partly away from the stasis, but that it was restored or actually really transformed by the neo-scholastic misinterpretation of Aquinas, which posited a pure nature entirely independent of grace, setting the stage for what Lubbock calls an autonomous nature, autonomous in the sense of being completely independent of God. Okay? And for Lubbock, there's a tendency to see humans in the world as autonomous from God that is more central to modernity than perfectibility emphasized by Niebuhr. Okay? And so that's probably a bit more sure what's going on in the Catholic world. Okay? And then it's particularly where secularization in the Protestant world took place gradually because the dominant conception of nature and human agency were only slight modifications of earlier theological formulations, secularism in the Catholic world attempted a much sharper break with existing pre- and early modern institutions. So you got sort of a gradualized secularization in the Protestant world, much more sort of jerky in a sense in the Catholic world. Okay, now we can now consider the issue of progress in millenarianism, which Vogelin and others see as central to modernity. As noted above, given the success of modernity in raising material living standards and breaking down bloodline-based social hierarchies really derived from the ancient pagan world, it could be reasonable to speak of modern society as achieving some kind of progress, at least in a tentative sort of way. From this standpoint, the wildly utopian political movements that have punctuated modern history could be seen not as essential features of the modern age, but rather as over-enthusiastic reactions to the legitimate successes of modernity. Perhaps even being provoked by the inability of early Christian theological formulations to admit the possibility of any kind of modest progress. Okay? And then finally, the movements of disillusionment that I argued could be properly described as Gnostic could be seen as reactions to the failure of those millenarian movements. Okay? So this kind of accounts well for the general trajectory of modernity. From the Reformation through the 18th century, economic growth, political reform, and gradual secularization in the Protestant world, and more modest economic growth but political stagnation in the Catholic world. From the French Revolution through the First World War, accelerating the ultimately ambiguous control over nature, encouraging increasingly more radical millenarian expectations, culminating in communism. And finally, after the First World War, shattered progressive ideologies, a proliferation of essentially Gnostic movements just simply trying to escape an irredeemable world. Okay? Now then, in order to complete all this, though, here's I got to bring Poteat in. Okay? Oh, by the way, let me just put. Oh, I don't want to erase that again. I'll just take it. Oh, okay. Yes.
I'll erase it if you want to. Go ahead.
Just take a second here. Okay. So what we've got here is this. Okay. Okay. So we've got. Let's say first of all, okay, modernity is ambiguous. Okay, there's kind of a good aspect and a bad aspect. This is real simple. And the bad aspect, okay, this seems kind of like sort of three moments of it. Okay, sort of the mechanism that's sort of most prominent in English-speaking world. The subjectivism you find primarily in Germany, of course, is also Descartes, but kind of a German kind of thing. And then finally, again, the idea of an autonomous nature in the Catholic world. Okay. And this, as Gunton sees it, sort of comes out of that inability to sort of work out a Trinitarian theology. Hang on a second, okay. Do it like this, okay. The Protestant world sort of comes out of nominalism. The Catholic sort of situation out of the static nature of neo-scholasticism. And they both sort of really come from, again, that failure to develop a Trinitarian theology, called un-Trinitarian. And then the good part, again, it does sort of ultimately come from Christianity. Now, here's where I have to bring Poteat in. Okay, now, Poteat sees modernity most broadly, time-wise here.
3 o'clock.
Oh, shoot, I gotta get moving here, okay. As the outcome of the incoherent medieval synthesis of Greek and Hebraic thought. Now, this sounds like Niebuhr, but it's really kind of different, okay. Now, okay, when Niebuhr sees them, hang on a sec, okay. Poteat argues that the implicit ontology of the ancient Hebrew, Poteat argues that the implicit ontology of the ancient Hebrews more correctly describes the fundamental structure of reality of the Greek philosophers, and was thus distorted by the application of Greek ontological concepts in Christian theology. Okay. Now, what then is the difference between the Greek and Hebraic ontologies? Now, this is the part, again, I think you're all very familiar with. As the first approximation, Poteat can be understood to say that the Greek philosophical model of reality is drawn primarily from visual experience, while the Hebraic model is drawn primarily from oral experience. Okay, all familiar with that part. Now, as it happens, there's a little more going on there. Poteat's argument that could be described as saying that Western thought since the Middle Ages has been characterized by a sort of parallax created by the incoherent mix of these two different models in Christianity. Okay? Now, one sort of obvious objection here is that although the differences between oral and literate mentalities might explain the difference between the literate culture of classical Greece and the oral culture of ancient Israel, they don't really explain the difference between Israel and its pagan neighbors, which are also, of course, oral cultures. And here it says, okay, a closer reading of Poteat indicates that ultimately he goes beyond the initial analysis deriving from the literature and oral and literate cultures, his final conclusion that orality and literacy really are ultimately only decisive, or not decisive, but only contributing factors in the difference between the Greek and Hebraic worldviews. Okay? And he says, okay, again, the Greeks really did take sort of kind of a pagan model of the growth and decay of natural fertility as their basic model. The Greek philosophers just reconceptualized this model in a more abstract and personal manner characteristic of literate thought. The Hebrews, by contrast, took as a model of order the actions of a paradigmatic personal speaker, one always faithful to his word. Okay, so then basically, there's a kind of the big parallax. It's essentially sort of the kind of more abstract paganism of the Greek philosophers, and again, the Hebraic picture of, again, the world is something makes spoken into existence by a paradigmatic personal speaker. Now then, Poteet's analysis of the genesis of modernity can now be restated as fully as follows. The full development of the implications of the Hebraic worldview was thwarted by the use of Greek philosophical concepts, perhaps not so much during the development of basic Christian doctrines, but as in late antiquity as during the Middle Ages, specifically in that the static and personal concepts of Greek metaphysics could not allow Western philosophy and theology to make sense of the dynamic, personal picture of reality actually at the core of Christianity. Okay, so here's the big thing then again. This sort of medieval synthesis kind of thwarted elements of the biblical picture from sort of really fully developing, so they came out in kind of a confused way. Okay? Modernity then for Poteat is the end result of a process in which the medieval culture becomes more aware of the contingency implied by the biblical understanding of God's action, but is unable to conceptualize any necessary limits to that contingency because the visual picture inherited from the Greeks cannot coexist with the sort of, again, more contingent Hebraic picture, leading eventually to a limitless contingency that is the nihilism of late modernity. I'll leave that part there. Now again, although Poteat does not express this issue explicitly, his analysis can also explain the ambiguous nature of modernity. Modernity works to the extent that the Hebraic model is dominant, as for example in actual scientific practice. It fails to the extent that the Greek model is misapplied to understand such phenomena. Okay. Now, very generally speaking, then we can say that the description of modernity implied by Poteat's analysis is one of the implications of the Hebraic model of reality emerging in a confused way, distorted by the residual elements of paganism, or more specifically of Greek philosophical paganism, in medieval consciousness. More specifically, Poteat's conception of the Hebraic worldview is the key to my claim that the positive features of modernity derive from Christianity. The picture of nature as a contingent creation of a paradigmatic speaker that is also ordered, that is subject to necessity by that speaker's faithfulness, is the conceptual basis for modern inductive experimental science, as opposed to the deductive science of the Greek philosophers. The contingency of the world also means there can be no eternally existing natural... I'll just leave that part, okay, just a second. Similarly, since each human being is a unique contingent creature of God, created by the unconditional love that is a manifestation of oral necessity, modern notions of freedom and equality can gradually break down the bloodline-based hierarchies of the ancient world. Now, certain of the negative features of the modern world can now be understood more clearly. Modernity's mechanistic ontology essentially pictures reality as radically contingent without the necessity of God's faithfulness, but rather only the necessity of a kind of truncated, static natural order. The Hebraic ontology, or rather a more fully worked out version of it, would have recognized Newtonian physics as an interpretation of only one dimension of reality, not a literal description of the entire cosmos. Similarly, modernity's subjectivism sees humans as embodying the creative capacity of the paradigmatic speaker without limitation of the necessity derived from faithfulness. And again, modern notions of social progress, which appear to be tentatively warranted by the real success of modernity, could be understood as a consequence, again, of sort of the Hebraic logic posited by Poteat, as humans gain a greater understanding of God's creation and use it to better their condition. And as already noted, the overenthusiastic millenarian attempts to accelerate this legitimate progress into projects to achieve heaven on earth could be understood as reactions to the refusal on the part of Orthodox Christian establishments to recognize the possibility of real progress. Finally, real important thing here. It would appear that what Poteat calls the oral logic of God's faithfulness corresponds to what Gunton calls the action of the Son, and particularly the Spirit. Poteat's ever-faithful speaker is clearly the Father, Creator. From a Trinitarian standpoint, one might think that Poteat has fallen into the historic Western theological trap of conceiving of God in one-dimensional terms. But the oral logic described by Poteat prevents this from happening. The clear implication of Gunton's theology is to articulate how the Spirit realizes harmonious particularity. And Poteat's oral logic indicates how this could be done. It is by working out more fully the logic inherent in the speech act. And again, the logic of the Speech Act, which Poteat sees as really kind of the model for the Hebraic picture of the world, gets sort of again, comes through in sort of a confused kind of partial way in the modern era. So you get seen some things right, but not everything right. And that sort of again is the basis of sort of like a millenarian and ultimately sort of Gnostic reactions to all that. That's kind of what sort of ties it all together. I'll stop there. I had one more example. I'll stop there.